Woe to the godless ideology, Part 2. Hello, a pleasant day to everyone. Today we will discuss the sequel or the Part 2 to the last video entitled A Godless Ideology, in which we discuss the origin, the evolution, the triumph, the failure, and the eventual decline of communism in the Philippines. Although it is not yet completely gone in the Philippine society, but then its present status can be viewed basically as nothing but a far cry, a mediocre state from the peak it achieved before its huge blunder during the 1986 People Power Revolution that toppled the administration of former President Ferdinand Marcos. After discussing its historic rise and fall, we will now try to discuss its philosophical, moral, and spiritual aspects that contribute to its futility and failed promise in supposedly providing salvation to the suffering, to the slavery, to the poverty, and to the destituteness of the masses of people. But before doing so, as always, let us first declare all glory and honor belongs to the Almighty Father. Hallelujah. Now let's tackle. Karl Marx, the acknowledged father of communism, developed his philosophy from uh, George Friedrich Hegel's dialectics. As a philosophy, dialectics upholds the duality of elements or aspects in nature and their relationship and dynamics, meaning the cohesion and contradiction which brings about the ever evolving change in a given body or object. Examples of the philosophy are the attraction and contradiction between positive and negative particles in an atom, the duality between male and female gender among animals, the dynamics between hot and cold temperature in nature, the interaction between opposite poles in a given body, and so forth. Karl Marx added flavor to the philosophy of dialectics and integrated it with his philosophy of materialism, as opposed to the philosophy of idealism. And hence, from it, he developed his own philosophy, which he called dialectical materialism. Using this philosophy in the study of history and society, Karl Marx developed his philosophy of or social philosophy of dialectical and historical materialism, from where his concept of communism emerged. Now, according to dialectical and historical materialism, the human society and henceforth human history has gone into four major and general stages of socio-political and economic development from the time humans first emerged on the surface of the earth, and where each stage draws from the material of the previous. Now, each stage of development also has its own peculiar characteristics, elements, and factors. In a nutshell, the four stages were the following. The first stage is what Marx or Marxism calls the primitive communism. It was supposedly the state of nature which occurred during the Stone Age period, and where every property was a communal property. There was still no social classes in society, and the primary elements of cohesion and contradiction occurred between man and nature because there is no private property. The society was both primitive and communal, or tribal and communal. According to the study of prehistory, the Stone Age period being pertained to by Karl Marx as the first stage of the evolution of societies lasted to about 2.5 million years and ended around 5,000 years ago when humans started to create the first civilizations around river valleys in the Near East. This was around roughly 3,000 years before the advent of Christ. The nomadic Stone Age tribes of people who transferred from one place to another in search of rich hunting grounds with favorable shelters would often encounter each other or other tribes for that matter, and thus the encounter would result to a tribal war. And so tribal wars would occur, and these tribes would fight for the territory they have at hand, or the territory they managed to find along the way when they were trying to search for rich hunting grounds. And so, such tribal wars would often yield slaves for the survivors of the vanquished tribe. That was how the ancient world jumped from the state of nature or from primitive communism to the second stage, which was the slave society or the slave society. Societies and civilizations do not actually evolve or even regress and progress at the same time. They do it not simultaneously, they do it rather at different stages and at different pace from each other, while others finally leaped from the state of nature or from primitive communism to slave society. Others remained in the stage of primitive communism. And so, on a macro societal analysis, the global or worldwide transition from societal stage to the next, at least from the first to the second stage, did not happen abruptly or simultaneously. Thus, it is aptly correct to describe it as, or the process as a social evolution instead of describing it as a revolution. If the so-called first stage or primitive communism characterized by the Stone Age period lasted for more than 2 million years, supposedly, then the second stage or the slave society, on the other hand, lasted for about a few thousand years. What is, however, striking to note is the fact that it coincided with the historic period, which in the study of history is described as that period when man invented the first system of writing and using it started recording his experiences from his environment and started what is defined presently as the first human civilization. The slave society from the establishment of the first human civilization at around 3000 BC generally lasted until the downfall of the Roman civilization at around 300 AD and the advent of European Dark Ages, or call it Middle Ages or medieval period. It was when the old slave societies started transitioning and transforming to become primarily agricultural societies. The third, societal stage under the Marxist philosophy. Although agriculture itself started as early as when human society established the first civilization along river valleys, however, tribal wars as well as the establishment of the first centralized government and leading to the first empires in history have rendered slaves as valued commodities, and hence they were considered far important than agricultural land itself. Even the ancient empires of Babylon and Persia and Macedonia and Rome relied so much on the role of the slaves in their societies. But of course, until the fall of the Roman Empire came, and where slowly an agriculture based feudal society was born. Whereas Marxism claims that primitive communism is the kind of society where no social classes existed, where the emergence of tribal wars and the establishment of slave society, on the other hand, had created the first social classes, namely the masters and their slaves. Now, at the downfall of the Roman Empire, the medieval period emerged and a new social system was established with the introduction of new social classes within society. The vast territory used to be controlled by the empire or by the Roman Empire disintegrated into smaller kingdoms and fiefdoms. So the age of kings and queens and monarchs emerged in history. Slave masters in the old slave society emerged to become nobles, and medieval kingdoms were born, while old slaves in the slave society, as well as free men, transitioned to become land tenants, farmers, or peasants, and hence the agricultural feudal society where the means and the mode of production revolved around land ownership and cultivation flourished. From master-slave relationship, people transitioned to feudal lord-peasant relationship in regard to the forces of production, as what Marxism defines. The agricultural feudal society that characterized the medieval period or the Middle Ages lasted until the early stages of Renaissance in the 13th century. The series of crusades produced several results. One was, it resulted in the emergence of new towns and cities, and secondly, the emergence of new type of people called artisans. Artisans were basically either commoners or free men or peasants who managed to develop certain skills in creating certain crafts, which later became commodities they sold in the public market. Artisans were also known as craftsmen. They were people who excelled in such crafts, such skills, such as metallurgy, who were then called blacksmiths. Also, people who were skilled in clay molding, who became potters. People who were skilled in making linens, who became weavers. People who were skilled in woodcrafts, who became wood carvers and carpenters. In short, people developed skills in creating all sorts of crafts and merchandise, and thus from their trade, from their creativity, they developed a system called mercantilism. And so, uh, this system is based on buying and selling merchandise or crafts in the public market. It was called mercantilism. And from that time on, since they flourished, mercantilism boomed, and the growth of markets characterized the early stages of the societal transition from feudal agriculture to capitalism, which is the fourth stage according to Marxism. Not only did mercantilism dominate the societies in the early transition from agriculture to capitalism, but Renaissance itself brought forth political transition to societies that ushered in the modern period. On the other hand, mercantilism, which produced the merchant class of people, eventually transformed them to modern day capitalists. These people at first worked with the European nobles or the kings and queens in search of new markets. When the Moors or the Muslims closed the trade route between Europe and Asia. In later years, the merchant class of people or the early capitalists supplanted the nobles during the political revolutions that occurred, creating new nation states and formalizing the global transition from agricultural feudal society to capitalism, which, according to Karl Marx, is the fourth stage in the evolution of global societies. The age of exploration and colonization in the beginning of the 15th century, initiated by European kingdoms, actually was the period that marked the transition and the succeeding scientific, industrial revolutions, and political revolutions that ushered the advent of constitutional liberal nation states, which completed that transition. Capitalism itself, according to Marx, is the present oppressive exploitative society humanity is into. To a Marxist, the class contradiction or the class struggle between the capitalist class who own the means and mode of production and all the factors in it, as against the proletariat or the working class who owns nothing but his own labor, breeds all the evils in society, all the ills that plague humanity at present. And although Marxists consider the philosophy of dialectical and historical materialism as a science, on the other hand, as a science of society itself, there are aspects in it that are subjective, such that in class contradiction and class struggle, or the subjective interests of the ruling class, such as the masters over their slaves, as well as the feudal lords over their vassals, as well as the capitalist class over the working class, and their perpetuation, as well as the perpetuation of the exploitative order and the maintenance of themselves in power over the lower class they are exploiting. It is a human tendency to maintain a certain order where one is comfortable or is enjoying, but then, because of the stratification and contradiction, human exploitation over other humans prevail. Such condition is what Karl Marx and those who believe in him initially would wanted to give an end to. That is a social system that promotes the exploitation of humans over other humans, the ruling class over those they exploit, and others like it. And since Karl Marx in his philosophy believed that the exploitation of the capitalist over the working class or the proletariat in the present society stems from the former's private ownership of the means and factors of production, then it becomes the duty of the working class to confiscate from the capitalists the tools and factors of production, establish their dictatorship, called the dictatorship of the proletariat, and push for the creation of socialism, the so-called first stage of global communist or global communism. Or, in short, in other words, it is a world where there exist no social classes and the means and factors of production are owned by the people themselves. But in truth, it will only be the party who will own it. Marxists, or people who believe in Marx and his philosophy, visualize this global order as the so-called communism, a classless society where everybody is equal and the exploitation of humans over humans through class contradiction and stratification will be eradicated. Initially, people thought of this as utopia, a perfect society imagined only by Thomas More, and exists only as a social theory in the mind of Karl Marx and of his adherents. However, when the Russians actually did it in a revolution led by Vladimir Lenin in 1917, then social thinkers realized that it could really be possible and true. The more so when the forces of Chairman Mao Zedong of Communist China followed it through with his own method of Chinese peasant-based revolution. Communism became a potent socio-political thought, an ideology that rivaled the free world after the Second World War. And so, because of that, the clash between the communist thought, or the communist philosophy realized by both Russia during the Bolshevik Revolution and the Chinese during the revolution in China, the Long March, the protracted war initiated by the Chinese communists, started. This clash, or the clash between the communist and the capitalist free world, was known as the Cold War. Now, until the communist thought and socialism itself as a social system collapsed in the early 90s and was rejected by the world in those years, then that was the only time when finally most of the world leaders realized that it, in fact, like many other social philosophy, has flaws, and it also was bound to fail. Now, with the failure of communism in the 1990s, what then is the problem of this ideology, which at the beginning promised emancipation for the human society against the so-called evils of man over his fellow men? Well, The problem lies with the nature of the ideology itself. This godless ideology. Karl Marx, in his abhorrence of religion, described religion as nothing but the opium of the people. His non-belief of God is not the issue, but rather his assertion that religion of whatever type is only being used by the religious leaders, however they may be called, to keep the mind of the people and the religious followers away from the truth of their exploited existence. In short, religion for him is simply used by people in power and authority to perpetuate their method of exploitation. Whether the religious leaders are aware of this or not, or deliberately doing this or not, the truth about religious beliefs, or whatever type of religion there is, that it really distracts people away from their social realities, even if itself is a part of the social reality, may somehow be true at a certain point. However, to Karl Marx, religion is nothing but a metaphysical idealism that the proletariat needs to combat in a secondary revolution called cultural revolution. But Karl Marx was already dead when his theory was materialized by Lenin in Russia during the Bolshevik Revolution, and he was also already dead when Mao Zedong initiated a secondary revolution called the Cultural Revolution in China. If the proletarian revolution was violent in itself and inhumane enough, what more then is a secondary revolution called cultural revolution, meant exactly to purify people's culture and psyche and to combat and eradicate counter-revolutionary tendencies and cultures such as the metaphysical idealism of religion, such as the decadence of the lumpen bourgeois in society, such as the individualistic residue and anti-labor tendency of the intellectuals, such as the liberalism of the general populace of people, and so on and so forth. There are many cultural tendencies that the revolutionary would combat just in order to push this secondary revolution called cultural revolution, so that they could push the communist ideology and make it dominate the world. Now, Mao Zedong's cultural revolution tried to eradicate the intellectuals in China through the Chinese Commune. His program was emulated by other Marxist revolutionaries, such as that of Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, but it resulted in the Cambodian killing fields, and we know how horrifying it was. Such draconian but horrible inhumanity exposes the ideology's subjectivity and or perhaps monstrosity on certain social issues which are in fact social realities and part of human society. Part of human society which the ideology of Karl Marx tries to eradicate from humanity. As if revolution is not violent enough, as well as the eradication of a group of people in society by another group of people for their tendencies and for labeling them as counter-revolutionaries who are enemies of the proletariat, but in fact only by the Communist Party itself. A case in point is what happened to the communists in the Philippines. After they failed and were left isolated during the popular revolt of the 1986 People Power Revolution, and then they slowly declined after that, the party chairman, no other than Jose Maria Sison, tried to find excuse for their failure, for the failure of their ideology, and then came up with a top-down analysis that blamed other party members for their so-called failure. The document he wrote was nothing but a mere excuse to deflect the blame on the party's central committee itself, and, in short, was an attempt to find a scapegoat for the blunder. And of course, those who were used as fall guys of the Central Committee would not accept it, for they themselves had sacrificed so much for the party and for the movement. They sacrificed almost majority of their lives, dedicating themselves to the cause of the revolution, and they all only would get this to be shabbily treated by the absolutism of the Central Committee chairman, the chairman of the party, controlled absolutely by its head. They thought of it as nothing but a repetition of what Joseph Stalin did in Russia. And so when they tried to defy him and his orders, the chairman labeled them. They labeled the chairman as manifesting the Stalinist tendency. And so, with their defiance, they took all the blame for the blunder, when all they did was to dedicate their lives for the movement, for the party. And then the Central Committee, in blaming them, branded them as counter-revolutionaries, and then later targeted them for assassination, for defying the Central Committee. And with the label of being counter-revolutionary, they were targeted for assassination with the orders coming from the chairman of the party himself. And yet, up to now, he denies any involvement with all the assassinations that the movement did against its own children. How many lives were lost when the Central Committee initiated the purgings? Well, this is, in fact, what they did was beyond human nature, or beyond what is considered humane. And this is the party and the movement that long ago promised salvation for the age-old problems of the people. Salvation from slavery, salvation from poverty, salvation from inequality, salvation from oppression and exploitation. How can it do its promise then, when this ideology does not even treat an individual as someone having a soul, and when it does not even have any respect for human life? And then all its chairman could do is lie and defend what he did in the name of principle, or what he did then as a part of party principles. How can it accomplish its mission to become the salvation of the people when its first mission, once it achieves and snatches power from the state or government through its bloody revolution, is to deny the individual his free will, his God-given free will. God gave humanity free will for a reason, and God gave people the capacity to be an individual in his own person for a divine reason. Why would the ideology violate that? The individual becomes a living zombie whose life and actuation will be limited by those sanctioned by the party once they snatch and capture state power. That is nothing but George Orwell's 1984. In its entire essence, it is contrary to everything humanity stands for. That is why it is a total failure. The social philosophy of dialectical and historical materialism, which spawns this theory of communism, rejects the idea nor the existence of the Almighty God. The reasons because they consider these ideas as mere idealism. Metaphysical idealism is how they define this. And hence, communists are godless people. They believe in materialism, the foundation of historical and dialectical materialism, their ideology. And that is why they treat life so low and very expendable. How can that kind of ideology be the salvation of humanity? Now, the communists, not only in the Philippines but all over the world, have lost it. Yet for some kind of monstrosity, the communists in the Philippines still hold on to that belief that somehow they will win it. They will win the battle for as long as they think that the social impetus that make them succeed in recruiting some few people would exist. And that is no matter how long the revolution may take. Let's say 10 years, 20, 30, 40. In fact, the communist movement in the Philippines has been here since 52 years ago, and they are willing to stick it out for even 100 years more. Their basic principle, which the party chairman Jose Maria Sison kept on hammering about and even proudly bragged about in the so-called second rectification movement that occurred between 1992 to 1998, was the Maoist-based protracted People's War. And the legacy he wanted to be proud of is to add his own name to the general concept of Marxism, to the lessons of Marxism. Thus, it will no longer just simply become Marxism and Leninism, but it will become Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong, and Jose Maria Sison thoughts. That is how he wanted things to be. And that is why he is dreaming of winning and keeping the revolution on and on and on, no matter if it takes even 100 years or so. That is how monstrous he has become and how closed-minded the people following him have become. They just prove the validity of the words of God about the emergence and the existence of these types of people in time as the end nears. And of course, they have no idea that they are the ones being alluded to in the words of God, and nothing but the proof of the primacy of the words of God, because they are the proof of it. And so, woe to the godless ideology. All glory and honor belongs to the Almighty Father. Amen.